Hello everyone, Chris here with another lecture. Today we'll be talking about blood flow to inactive regions of the body during exercise. And so in our past few lectures we talked about more metabolically active regions during exercise, such as our cardiac muscle and our skeletal muscle. And of course, as exercise intensity goes up, so does their demand for oxygen, and therefore we deliver more blood flow to these regions during exercise. But what happens to these more inactive regions? So the learning objective here for today, first we're going to review some concepts, including the muscle pump and the hydraulic model of circulation. Then we're going to talk about how blood flows to non-muscular organs or inactive organs like the intestines, the splanchnic circulation, during dynamic exercise, and then we're going to understand the importance of splanchnic vasoconstriction in our cardiovascular response to exercise. But first, recall in previous lectures that our peripheral blood volume is sensitive to changes in blood flow, meaning that we have regions of the body which are more compliant than others, and when we deliver more blood flow to these regions, they're going to hold on to more of that blood flow. And in addition to that, increases in cardiac output result in decreases in preload. And that ties in with that hydraulic model of circulation, because when we increase cardiac output or blood flow to these compliant regions of the body, less of that blood is going to make its way back to the heart, back to the right atrium. And so a lot of that blood is going to accumulate in the veins of those regions, in particular two highly compliant beds are the splanchnic circulation and the skin. So, if that blood is being distributed to these areas and not returning to the right atrium, we're going to have a decrease in preload, and consequentially, we could have reductions in stroke volume, cardiac output if nothing else changes. And so the performance of the heart is tightly coupled to the control of the peripheral vasculature. So again, if we're not able to deliver that blood flow from the peripheral vasculature, from these highly compliant regions, and make it back to the heart, well, then we're going to have a reduction in cardiac output. And that would not be good if we're trying to keep up exercise. So what's the importance of the inactive regions? So we have this increase in cardiac output during exercise from about 5 liters all the way up to 25, 30, maybe even 40 liters per minute. And we have an increase in muscle blood flow, right? So we're delivering 25 to 40 more times the amount of blood to the skeletal muscles at rest. And so cardiac output's going up, and we know from this last slide that increases in cardiac output decrease preload when nothing else changes. How come preload isn't being reduced during physical activity? And so for one reason, it's because the muscle pump, since we are passing most of our cardiac output through that skeletal muscle, we're not seeing the same drops in preload during physical activity. But that is great, but we also have to keep in mind that the skeletal muscle is not going to be effective in compliant regions. So if we deliver more cardiac output overall and more blood flow does wind up in some of those compliant regions, the skeletal muscle pump is not going to serve any purpose there to help deliver some of that venous blood back to the right atrium and increase preload. So the muscle pump is really only effective when we have most of the cardiac output going away from the compliant regions and going towards the skeletal muscle or non-compliant regions. And in order to do that, if we want to redistribute that blood flow from inactive organs to skeletal muscle tissue, then we're going to have an increase in sympathetic vasoconstriction to minimize blood flow and blood volume to these compliant regions. And so the maintenance of stroke volume and cardiac output during exercise requires a balance between purely mechanical effects of the muscle pump, which is helping to deliver blood flow back to the heart to sustain stroke volume and cardiac output, and we need to have the sympathetic control of the blood vessels. So again, this points to a main point here that two requirements are necessary to keep up our cardiac output and to keep up our cardiovascular response during physical activity. And so requirement number one is going to be that a large fraction of that cardiac output must pass through low compliant skeletal muscle, right? And then a fraction of cardiac output passing through the compliant regions must decrease. So we need to have a little bit going through these highly compliant regions, which are going to hold on to blood, and most of the cardiac output going through the skeletal muscle. And so that's going to ensure that, one, again, blood's not going to accumulate in the highly compliant veins of these different circulations of our body, and that also that we are taking most of that cardiac output and delivering it to the skeletal muscle, which is not only utilizing the oxygen, but it's helping to sustain our blood flow during exercise, because most of that blood that is going to be delivered to the skeletal muscle is going to be delivered right back through the heart. And so again, that's an effect that we call the muscle pump. And so it's a effective, powerful pump to rapidly increase preload during exercise. And so you could see the effects when you remove the muscle pump on cardiac output. And so without the muscle pumping, right, without that skeletal muscle contracting and helping deliver blood flow back to the right atrium, cardiac output cannot increase more than 1 to 2 liters. And if we're trying to get 20, 25, 30, 40 liters of blood per minute during exercise, well, this bump up of only 1 to 2 liters of blood is not going to help at all. So it is necessary for those skeletal muscles to be delivering blood back to the heart in order to maintain any aerobic dynamic exercise. And so the blood that does not pass through the contracting muscle will not be pumped back to the heart. Again, skeletal muscle pump has no effect on these regions of the splanchnic circulation, right? That it can't compress and it can't drive up pressure to deliver more blood back to the heart. And so if that is occurring, we see a decrease in preload and stroke volume. And so humans have two large, highly compliant beds, including the splanchnic circulation and the skin. We could see here the hydraulic model of circulation. If this is our pump here, right, and we had a tubing that just continuously went from that pump, in our case our heart, all the way back. So here's how it works. You can consider this like your left ventricle, and blood is going to be pumped out. If it was continuous tubing just right to the back of the heart, whatever would be pumped out would just return, right? But since we have these compliant regions, a lot of that blood is going to be accumulated here and not going to make its way back to the heart. So you could see that reduces stroke volume. And if you add more of these compliant regions, well, then that's going to further reduce preload. But if you do a couple of steps here, if you start to vasoconstrict or cut off the blood flow to these compliant regions, and then you circulate more of that blood through non-compliant regions, and if you also have the skeletal muscle pump helping pump up blood, well, then you're going to see a lesser reduction in preload, right? So if you vasodilate both these regions at the same time, you're going to see a drop in preload. So during exercise, we can't have this happen. So we need to have both of those steps. We need to see sympathetic nervous activity going up. And during our aerobic exercise, it's going to help bump up cardiac output, but it's also going to help increase vasoconstriction to these compliant regions. So therefore, blood can be delivered back, and that cardiac output can remain high during exercise. And then in addition to that, you have more blood flow being delivered to skeletal muscles, and that's going to help with the reduction in preload, and it's actually going to help restore preload because it's generating that pressure to deliver blood back to the heart. But, this can come with some issues because, so what happens to blood flow through inactive organs during exercise, and how is blood flow controlled? Well, obviously, we're going to have a cutoff in blood flow to help redistribute that blood to the skeletal muscles and the cardiac muscles, which need more of that oxygen. And so what's the effects on cardiac performance if neural control of splanchnic vascular resistance is not maintained? Well, as you saw, there's going to be a reduction in that preload, and therefore we wouldn't be able to maintain aerobic exercise. And what's the functional significance of regional blood volume on the redistribution of blood volume and oxygen and our mean arterial pressure, right? So we need to discuss that the splanchnic circulation receives a lot of blood at rest. And so, in most adults, that's around 1.5 liters of blood per minute, or 25% of our cardiac output. It's the largest regional circulation. It receives the most blood flow during rest, right? And so all these important organs here, right, our liver, our small intestines, our large intestine, all these digestive organs, at rest they receive a lot of this blood flow, and they have an oxygen extraction of around 50 to 60 milliliters per minute, and this is considered around a 15 to 20% extraction, which means they have a large way to go. So if they needed to extract more oxygen from the blood to increase that AVO2 difference, they definitely could do so. And so this means that you can have these large reductions in blood flow without compromising oxygen supply. And this sort of gets into what we're talking about here today, because that's what's going to happen during physical activity. We're going to have less blood flow to these regions of the body, and then more blood flow to places like the heart and the skeletal muscles that are working. But this oxygen that it's utilizing remains the same. It still needs to carry out resting metabolic functions. It's still going to need a certain level of oxygen. So luckily, we can increase oxygen extraction from the limited blood that it has, and this is going to help make the difference. And so the liver has the greatest cardiovascular importance. It's going to receive all of the splanchnic blood flow, and it's going to help filter out some of the nutrients and materials within that blood. But this region is highly compliant. It's 10 times greater than the total vascular compliance or intestinal compliance. And so a lot of times, even just by breathing, your liver swells up with blood. So it's going to hold on to a lot of blood volume at rest. And if we don't redirect some of that blood flow away, it can have detrimental consequences as far as cardiac output and blood delivery is concerned. And so let's look at VO2, comparing rest and exercise. And so again, VO2 is not just a regional thing. It's not just an overall thing. So we can measure VO2 in the whole body, which is going to be determined by the level of work or the level of physical activity. But we could also look at this regionally as well. So we could look at the VO2 demands of the splanchnic, kidneys, and muscle and compare them for rest versus exercise. So, sorry about that. Again, we are first looking at blood flow. And so splanchnic circulation around 1.5 liters, the kidneys 1.2 liters, the muscle can range depending on how much muscle mass someone has, but roughly, let's say, 1 liter of blood per minute. And when you look at the relative percentages at rest, roughly a quarter, roughly 20 to 25% for the kidneys, and then 18% of the cardiac output for the muscle. And the oxygen uptake here is 60 for the muscles, 60 for the splanchnic circulation, a little bit lower in the kidneys, right? Which gives you a VO2 difference, of 4 in the splanchnic circulation, 6 in the muscle, and 1.2 in the kidneys. So now what's going to happen is that this is at rest. And so during exercise, it's going to change. The oxygen uptake is, of course, going to change for the skeletal muscle because obviously it's working harder. It has an increased metabolism, so it needs to take in more oxygen. But these demands for the splanchnic and the kidneys are going to remain the same. But the problem is that during exercise, due to sympathetic vasoconstriction, their blood flow is going to be significantly reduced. And here you see that the amount of blood flow that the splanchnic circulation is getting is 1/5 roughly, or about a fifth or a quarter of what it was receiving at rest, and very similar reduction in blood flow for the kidneys. And all of that blood flow, where is it going, right? It's going to that skeletal muscle. And we're looking here at VO2 max, so this is the extreme, but 87, 89, 90% of our cardiac output is going to go to that skeletal muscle, which is going to dramatically reduce the amount going to the splanchnic circulation and the other inactive regions of the body. But again, this stays the same. The oxygen needed for metabolism and for metabolic function even during exercise is going to remain the same. And so if you want to keep VO2 the same and your cardiac output is reduced, well then how are you going to be able to keep that the same? And so we know based off that formula, VO2 equals cardiac output times AVO2 difference, well then of course you're going to need to get a significant increase in that AVO2 difference, in that oxygen extraction. So that's exactly what happens, and that's what allows the cells of the splanchnic circulation in the kidneys to have less blood flow overall, but still keep that same VO2 during exercise, even though they're getting significantly less oxygen delivered. By the fact that they're able to increase the oxygen extraction, they're able to keep this number the same. And so it's not only the skeletal muscle, the metabolically active regions that increase their AVO2 difference, but also the inactive regions as well. And so it's very important that we have this cutoff in blood flow to the splanchnic circulation. Because going back to the last page here, if we're going to increase the amount of blood going to the skeletal muscles by 20-fold, by 30-fold, right? We're going to need to be this increase in cardiac output that is happening. We're still going to need to be able to redistribute that. So you need that splanchnic vasoconstriction in order for that to occur. And so you could see what happens when you remove that innervation is that you get significant decreases in cardiac output and then stroke volume. Right? And this is the reason why you see such a reduction. And so here we see an animal study here with two groups of dogs during exercise and then rest. And then what we're seeing is basically when we cut off that sympathetic nervous activity to the splanchnic circulation, what is that going to mean for our blood pressure, or cardiac output, or heart rate, or stroke volume during exercise? So here we see the effects, right? And here's the normal response in controlled dogs, so rest and then maximal exercise, rest and then exercise for stroke volume, for blood pressure, for cardiac output. And we see that the main thing here is that our stroke volume is going to be reduced dramatically during exercise. And you see a consequence of that is that our cardiac output during exercise is reduced dramatically, right? And so, we see some compensation here that heart rate is going to increase. And you may say, well, then why don't we see any reductions in blood pressure? And so you have to remember that since, the body cares most about mean arterial pressure, that in this example, even though we're getting a cutoff in vasoconstriction to the splanchnic circulation, that the body is then probably vasoconstricting other regions of the body in order to compensate for the deficiencies that it's having at the splanchnic circulation. But the main point here, again, it's that reduction in preload. So without this innervation to the splanchnic circulation, you can't maintain cardiac output during exercise because the inability to vasoconstrict the splanchnic circulation is going to reduce your preload, reduce your cardiac output, and therefore it's going to impact your exercise performance. And so, along with the redistribution of blood flow means there's a redistribution of oxygen, primarily to the more metabolically active skeletal muscle. And this reduction in splanchnic blood volume from 1,500 to 350 milliliters per minute redistributes roughly 1.15 liters per minute of blood flow and 250 milliliters of oxygen to active tissue. And so if we want to maintain, since we're getting rid of so much oxygen and so much blood flow to the splanchnic circulation, if we want to keep its metabolism, its VO2 the same, we need to increase that AVO2 difference. There needs to be an increase in oxygen extraction. And so to summarize all of this, in order to maintain preload and cardiac output during exercise, the majority must pass through the contracting muscle, since one, it's not compliant, and two, it can help maintain preload during aerobic exercise. We must also reduce the blood flow passing through the highly compliant regions, because if we have an inability to do that, well then we will decrease stroke volume, decrease cardiac output. We're not able to keep up performance during exercise. Large reductions in splanchnic blood flow are accommodated by increases in oxygen extraction. So that's how we maintain VO2. If we want these splanchnic cells to keep up their level of metabolism, they need to increase that AVO2 difference since their cardiac output has gone down. Splanchnic vasoconstriction occurs when vasovagal withdrawal is complete. So again, that increase in cardiac output that we see from rest to 100 beats per minute, that's all due to the vasovagal withdrawal. And we're not going to see increases in sympathetic nervous activity until we get to 100 beats per minute. And that's when we're going to see further increases in cardiac output and then that increase in vasoconstriction, global vasoconstriction. The inability to vasoconstrict the splanchnic circulation leads to an inability to maintain cardiac output and potentially mean arterial pressure. And then splanchnic vasoconstriction redistributes not only blood flow and volume to contracting skeletal muscle, but also oxygen. All right, very good, everyone. So this will be so we got one more lecture here, and that will be concerning regulations of blood pressure during physical activity. Thank you guys so much, and see you next lecture.